We're going to see that in Sefer Bamidbar there are 3 occasions where a question is brought to Moshe, something that's actually going to revolutionize an element of Judaism, and in each case there is the possibility of believing that the question was also posed to others as well. Rashi treats each of the 3 cases differently. The Rebbe will ask why and take a very pragmatic approach to understanding the setting. Where and under what circumstances were these questions posed? Even pasuk in Parshas Bnei Tzlafchad. Let's start with the pasuk in our parsha about the daughters of Tzlafchad, where they came. They stood themselves in front of Moshe, ve'lifnei Elazar HaKohen, as well as in front of Elazar, who was at that point now the Kohen Gadol, ve'lifnei Hanasim, and in front of the Nasim, b'chol ha'eda, in the entire Jewish community. Pesach Ohel Moed Leimor, and they stood at the entrance to Ohel Moed, and they said as follows: that our father died and he had no sons, and what do we do with the inheritance? Why should we lose out a portion in Eretz Yisrael? So the Sifri brings a debate between 2 opinions. These 2 opinions will be really central to our conversation. And they said, firstly, the Sifri asked the question in Moshe, Loi Hayo Yadeh. The order of the pasuk is strange. They asked Moshe, and then it sounds like after that they went to ask Elazar. So if Moshe didn't know, how would Elazar know? So therefore, the first suggestion the Sifri makes is Ela Sareis Hamikra V'Darshayu. Actually, you have to understand. You have to darshan the pasuk and understand it in reverse order, that they first went to Elazar and then they went to Moshe, and that's Divrei Rabbi Yoshia. There's another opinion. No, but Beis HaMedrash, everybody was sitting together in the Beis HaMedrash, and the daughters of Tzlafchad appeared in front of the entire crowd in the Beis HaMedrash, and that gives us a different perspective. It doesn't mean that they first asked Moshe and then others. Now, dieselbe Plukta werd gebracht in Sifri in noch 2 Erte. The same debate is quoted by the Sifri in 2 different places. Aleph in Parshas Pesach Sheni in Parshas Ba'aloischa, with the story of the question of those who lost out the opportunity to bring the Korban Pesach, and that eventually resulted in the Pesach Sheni. That's recorded in Parshas Ba'aloischa. From Pasuk of Vayikru v'lifnei Moshe v'lifnei Aaron. Same kind of thing. The Pasuk says they brought the question in front of Moshe and then in front of Aaron. So again, Rabbi Yosha says switch it around. Abba Chanin says they were sitting in a Beis HaMedrash. And the third is Beis in Parshas Mekoshe Sheitzim in Parshas Shlach from Pasuk Vayikriv Oisei El Moshe v'el Aaron v'kol ha'eda, with the story of the person who was caught chopping wood on Shabbos. Nobody knew how he was supposed to be executed. There also the question was brought in front of Moshe and Aaron. Again, Rabbi Yosha says switch around the order. Abba Chanin says they were all sitting together in the Beis HaMedrash. That's the Sifri. Let's have a look at Rashi, because Rashi does something unusual. We see something strange in Rashi. In Parashat Ba'aloischa, when Rashi addresses this question of the order of who the question was posed to in the story of the Pesach Sheni, Ba'aloischa, is an Mefarish. He says as follows: Lifnei Moshe ve'lifnei Aaron means k'sheshneim yoshvin bebeis hamedrash bo'u u'sha'olum. Both Moshe and Aaron were sitting in the Beis HaMedrash, and then these people came to ask their question. And it obviously wouldn't make any sense to say that first they asked Moshe and then Aaron. Because if Moshe wouldn't have had the answer, how would Aaron have had the answer? So there Rashi clearly goes with the opinion of Abba Chanan. They're sitting in the Beis HaMedrash. In the story of the Mekoshe Sheitzim in Parashat Shlach, where the question apparently is posed to Moshe and Aaron and the entire community, is Rashi gone at Mefarish? Rashi doesn't say a word. And in our parasha, he brings both opinions and he quotes their names, which he doesn't do in Parashas Ba'aloischa. Question is, why? 3 identical circumstances and 3 totally different approaches. Maybe the easiest one to answer would be the one in Parashat Shlach. So Rashi is going to Mefarish in Parashat Shlach, and friend, maybe you'll excuse the fact that Rashi doesn't address this in Parashat Shlach by saying, because he's just spoken about it in Parashas Ba'aloischa and told us that Moshe and Aaron were sitting together in the Beis HaMedrash when they asked the question about Pesach Sheni. So you'll realize the same thing must have happened with the Mekoshe Sheitzim, because it's just one parasha later, and fine. Aber das, was bei Parashat Sheni bringt to beide days of Shem Emron, is in ganzen nicht verstandig. But the fact that Rashi brings 2 opinions in our parasha and quotes them both by name, that is particularly strange. Because von dem, was Rashi bringt in Parashat Ba'aloischa, noch dem Pirush k'sheshneim yoshvin chole is moving. Not the Pirush k'sheshneim yoshvin chole is moving. The fact in Parashat Ba'aloischa, Rashi is satisfied with just a simple answer. Moshe and Aaron are sitting together in the Beis HaMedrash. That actually makes sense. As blows their Pirush from Abba Chanan is matamin pshutei shel mikra, because Rashi wants to stick with a pshat, and the explanation that is closest to pshat is the explanation of Abba Chanan that Moshe and Aaron are sitting together in the Beis HaMedrash. Und wie es ist moving bepashtas, One thing's for sure, as Sareisa Mikra, that to suggest that we reverse the order of how a pasuk is presented is Niklatagim Pshuto Shel Mikra. That's definitely not aligned with Pshat. And Rabbi Yoshe Alein is Madgish. Rabbi Yoshe himself says it when he introduces this possibility. He says, Sareisa Mikra v'dor sheyu, that it's drush, that it's not in the world of Pshat. As Medaf onkommt in Derech Hadrash. So that makes sense. We get Parshas Ba'aloischa, we get why Abba Chanin is there. The big question is our parsha. Look at how Rashi treats this issue in our parsha. The fact that Rashi quotes both opinions, Rabbi Yoshe included, is muchach as eich das Rabbi Yoshe is behesem to pshuto shel mikra, means that Rashi feels that Rabbi Yoshe's suggestion that you have to reverse the pasuk in the order of the pasuk in order to understand it actually suits the pshat of our pasuk. That's very strange. There is noch starker damit, was Rabbi Yoshe's Pirish is noch makdim zum Pirish von Abba Chanin. And even more surprising is the fact that out of the two opinions, Rashi first gives us Rabbi Yoshe's opinion, which appears to be the one less inclined to Pshat. Why bring that one first? Noch mehr, even furthermore. In Parshas Ba'aloischa steht nor lifnei Moshe v'lifnei Aaron. Parshas Ba'aloischa, there are only two options of who the question was posed to, Moshe and Aaron. So if you were to use Rabbi Yoshe's approach and say, switch the order of the pasuk, it's easy, just switching Moshe and Aaron. But in our parsha, there are a list of people. So there's three possibilities. As the Sirus HaMikra has been dry. Then, if you're going to go with Rabbi Yoshe's opinion, which is to say reorder the pasuk, there are now three people to change with each other. Nesiim, Elazar, Moshe. So that's already further from Pshat. You're going to now jumble up the pasuk with three elements that have to be changed, in order-wise. And this is where Rashi suggests that Rabbi Yoshe is a viable opinion according to Pshat. And the first? All right, let's try and answer, see if it works. Maybe we could have explained as the difference between Rashi's approach in Ba'aloischa to only quote Abba Chanin's opinion that they were in the Beis HaMedrash, as opposed to our parasha where he brings both opinions. Maybe that's verbunden mit den Shinei Haloshen in die Psukim, but because there's a difference, maybe it's linked to the fact that there's a difference in the wording of the two Psukim. In Parshas Ba'aloischa steht nor, Parshas Ba'aloischa says simply, Lifnei Moshe v'lifnei Aaron, that this was presented in front of Moshe and in front of Aaron without giving us any location. Is the Rebbe mistavelei pshuto shel mikra? So the pshat would support the argument. Two people sitting together, it's likely that they're sitting in a Beis HaMedrash. So Rashi's happy to use that as the explanation, but maybe he's a little bit more hesitant to use that explanation in our parasha. Why? Because our parasha says that it's Moshe, Aaron, the Nesiim, and the entire community. Where's the entire community going to fit in a Beis HaMedrash? Is the far Rashi don't need mefarish b'pirishoshin v'yikri as b'meis hamidrash yoshvin? Maybe that's the reason Rashi doesn't want to prioritize an argument that says they're all sitting in the Beis HaMedrash. Val b'pashtos is nichaychas kol eidos zayin in Beis HaMedrash, because it doesn't seem logical, if you want to know the pshat, to say the entire community is sitting in a Beis HaMedrash. Maybe that's why Rashi prefers to stick Rabbi Yoshe's opinion in and actually put it first. But that assumes that the whole nation was crowded into the Beis HaMedrash, and that's not necessarily what Kol Ha'edah means at all. In fact, from evidence in our parasha itself. This cannot be the answer. Val, firstly, there's two reasons. One is a parenthetical reason, one is the primary reason. Val, first of all, still, if that is the explanation, because of the difference in the psukim, Rashi should have at least addressed the order of Moshe and Aaron in Parashat Shlach, which he doesn't comment on at all. Because that pasuk also included not only Moshe and Aaron, like in Parashat Ba'aloischa, but also the whole community. then obviously, if the whole community is there, the issue we've just raised, Rashi can't rely on the fact that in Parshas Ba'aloischa he said everybody's in the Beis HaMedrash, because it was fewer people in Parshas Ba'aloischa. It was just Moshe and Aaron, and here it's everybody. But besides that technical point is Nosef Lozeh Kasha, there's a bigger issue over here, and that is who said Kol Ha'eda means the entire community. Rashi allein hat beferish gesagt in Seif Parshas Tisa. Rashi already told us in Parshas Kisisa, Keitzad Seder HaMishnah, how was the transmission of information, the Torah Shabbal Peh shared with the Jewish people? Nichnasu kol ha'am. Well, everybody came in to hear. Das heißt, as in dem Ort Beis HaMedrash von Moshe hat gelernt Torah mit in seiner rein kol ha'am. Well, that indicates that it is possible for the entire community to come in to the so-called Beis Medrash, whatever forum Moshe was using to teach. Well, if in the normal course of teaching the information that the Eibishter wanted to impart to the Jewish people, Kol Ha'eda could come along to listen, and that's called the Beis Medrash, well then in our case over here it is possible that everybody could be in the Beis HaMedrash. You know why? Because everybody is not really everybody. Und der Tam bazeh. When we use expressions like Rashi has used over there, the entire nation, or like the Pasuk has used over here, the entire assembly or congregation, doesn't literally mean every single Jew who was alive at the time. It's those who wanted to come and learn. Or like Rashi says in our parasha, as we'll see in a moment. Und over Mele ist nicht token Schwierigkeit zum Vorsein, als sie alle Moshe erlassen die Nesim und Kol Ha'eda seien given bei Beis HaMedrash. So then it's not so far-fetched to say that all of these people, Moshe, Aaron, the Nesim, and whoever is included in the term Kol Ha'eda are inside the Beis HaMedrash, because Kol Ha'eda is actually a very specific term. Why is it a specific term? Because in our parasha, Rashi actually tells us Kol Ha'eda refers to a specific group. Noch mehr, in unser Pasuk. The truth is that the simplest explanation would have been, like Abba Chanin, to say all the people being addressed over here with this question are in the Beis HaMedrash. Why? Because over here the pasuk specifically uses the word Eda, not nation. And Rashi has explained multiple times, including in our parasha, as Kol Eda kenach not the Sanhedrin, that Kol Eda could mean just the Sanhedrin. And if it's just the Sanhedrin with the Nesim and Moshe and Elazar in one space, then we're back to our original question. Why doesn't Rashi just go to the simplest answer, which is they're all together in the Beis HaMedrash, and that's why we're not so worried about the order in which the people are mentioned, and Rashi should have used that as Pirush Rishon Be'ikri as the first and primary explanation of this pasuk, but he doesn't. He puts Rabbi Yoshia in as well, and he puts Rabbi Yoshia first, and we have to understand why. So it's zwischen the pasuk beParshas Ein and the pasuk beParshas Ba'aloischa. Okay, so the first distinction we drew between Ba'aloischa and our parasha is Ba'aloischa does not specify where they got together, and here it tells us how many people there were, which gave the impression that maybe it wasn't in a Beis HaMedrash. But now we're going to see even more specifically. Our pasuk actually gives us a location. Was damit wollte man nachher gekannt mevor sein dem Tam was Rashi is domeshana von seinem Friedrich Pirish. And this distinction we're about to draw between Parshas Ba'aloischa, where the location is left undisclosed, and our parasha where the location is listed, maybe that's the reason why Rashi can't give the same explanation here as he gave in Parshas Ba'aloischa. So in Parshas Ba'aloischa wird nicht angedeutet in Pasuk wo Moshe waren seine Gewinn. In Parshas Ba'aloischa it doesn't specify where Moshe and Aaron were. So Rashi says, we don't know where it is. Perhaps it's in the Beis HaMedrash. That would actually be a satisfactory explanation. But in unser Parsha, steht beferish in Pasuk, as es eine gewinn Pesach Oil Moed. Whereas our Parsha tells us exactly where they were. They were in the entrance of Oil Moed. As the Fall will Rashi nicht lernen befirush Horish and Va'ikri as beBeis HaMedrash ayu yoshvin. That might well be the reason why Rashi does not want to use as his primary explanation that the Jews, Moshe and Aaron, etc., are in the Beis HaMedrash, because the pasuk doesn't say Beis HaMedrash; it says Pesach Ohel Moed. Maybe that's why he first goes for Rabbi Yoshia's opinion that you've got to just juggle around the pasuk. But it's not a good explanation. Actually, for very logical reasons, where do you think this Beis HaMedrash was, if not at Pesach Chol Moed? Logic says the Beis HaMedrash we're referring to and Pesach Chol Moed is actually the same place. Because Pesach Oil Moed vert gemeint de Chatzar HaMishkan. Because when we refer to the entrance to Oil Moed, we're actually talking about the courtyard of the Mishkan, which is where the Beis HaMedrash was, as Rashi has already told us. On the Beis HaMedrash is given in Chatzar HaMishkan leben Mizbeach. We very well know that the primary place of Torah learning is in that same courtyard, right next to the Mizbeach. Vi Rashi zogt in honor from Pashas Mishpatim, as Rashi tells us in the beginning of Mishpatim, Shetosim Sanhedrin. Where do you put the highest court, which is also at that stage the highest learning center of the Jewish community, Eitz al HaMizbeach, next to the Mizbeach. B'meila, ken men zogin, as Pesach Ol Moed meint Beis HaMedrash, and therefore there is no contradiction between the pasuk saying Pesach Ol Moed and Abba Chanin's explanation that they were sitting in the Beis HaMedrash. And even besides that base, even if you want to stretch the point, as we can need zogin, as der pasuk zal mit Pesach Ol Moed meinen Beis HaMedrash. For whatever reason, you want to say this pasuk, when it says Pesach Oil Moed, that's not the same place as the Beis HaMedrash. You'd have to explain why that is the case. And let's say that Pesach Oil Moed is not the Beis HaMedrash, then why does Rashi bring it as one of his explanations? Rashi should have just said they were all standing together. So in other words, if the question is who did they ask first, we'll say the whole group. Rashi doesn't have to tell us that is in a Beis HaMedrash. He could just rely on the pasuk saying it's at Pesach Oil Moed. But Rashi says, also Abba Chanin's opinion, which is that it's in the Beis HaMedrash. That implies that Rashi is not of the view that Pesach Oil Moed is a different place to the Beis HaMedrash. So, in order to understand all of this, let's try and visualize what's actually going on and ask ourselves the question, what do we actually mean when the Sifri or Rashi says, what were they thinking after, theoretically, if Moshe doesn't have the answer, which he didn't, right, because he had to go consult Hashem, somebody else is going to have the answer. What do you mean somebody else is going to have the answer? So let's focus in on that for one moment. What does it mean if Moshe hadn't known? For Pirish Rashi is mashma. If you go with Rashi's view, it implies as pshat l'shein hakosef is mechiach. The way the language of the pasuk is laid out, that is what indicates to us, as the shaila from the anashim ashahoyu geimun from bnei tzlofchad, that the question, whether it was the question at the time of Pesach Sheni or the question here, the daughters of Tzlofchad, is gefrek geworden fayedem von den nisholim bazunder. It sounds from the pasuk that the question was asked to a group of people, but one person at a time. Lifnei Moshe, velifnei Aaron, lifnei Moshe, velifnei Elazar. But even if you're asking a question to two separate individuals, that could happen in two ways. You could have two people standing in front of you, and you're asking the question to both of them, Lifnei Moshe v'Lifnei Aaron, but it's simultaneous. Or you go ask Moshe, he doesn't have the answer, so you go running to Aaron. So therefore, after Rashi has explained in Parshas Ba'alo Yisra that in that case it was that was a scenario where the two of them were sitting together, Moshe and Aaron, and the people who wanted to bring the Pesach offering but couldn't address their question to them, is a marich nitvi darke b'chama mekaymes to shelo zayne oifen dezeh achazeh. There Rashi is clear that this could not have been a scenario where they presented the question first to Moshe and subsequently to Aaron. He says, you cannot suggest that. Because logic says if Moshe would not have had the answer, how would anybody expect that Aaron would have had the answer? So Rashi appears to be doing something similar in our parasha, because what does he say? Is it possible if Moshe hadn't had the answer that Elazar would have? That implies that Rashi wants us to be clear about the fact they never thought to first ask Moshe and then ask Elazar. Beyond that, even more so. Nachdem Rashi befirusha beparasha saying is matik from pasuk lifnei Moshe. Look how Rashi does this. He takes the words out of the pasuk lifnei Moshe that they presented the question to Moshe. Is a mamshech Mosif. Rashi then adds his own words ve'achar kach, and after that lifnei Elazar. They went in front of Elazar. Was Shishler as demit is Rashi oisen zum madgish sein, which seems to be that Rashi's highlighting as the word for lifnei meant punkt wie es wort stehen in pasuk ve'achar kach lifnei Elazar, that Rashi wants us to see in the pasuk as if the words ve'achar kach were in the pasuk, as if the Torah is telling us the question went to Moshe and afterwards to Elazar. Shleima asbora bazeh. Let's explain it. Then in pasuk v'gestanden lifnei Moshe ve'Aaron, had the pasuk said in front of Moshe and Aaron without the second word lifnei. Or in our parasha, if the pasuk had said that the question was posed to Moshe and Elazar without the word lifnei in between the two names, then then it would have been clear to us that the question was only posed once, and Rashi wouldn't have to explain anything. The question was posed to Moshe and Aaron happened to be there, or was posed to Moshe and Elazar happened to be there. Das kann euch heißen, als die Scheile ist gefragt geworden beikar by Moshe, and that would imply that the question was really directed towards Moshe. Und das, was es wird der Montag whoever else is mentioned in Parashas Ba'aloischa, Aaron, in our parasha, Elazar, is not valid with Metzias, is a damal given zusammen mit Moshe, and that's only because realistically they happened to be in the room at the time, not because they were the people the question was directed to. And if that were the case, Rashi wouldn't have had to explain anything, but that's not how the pasuk works. Because the pasuk added an extra word lifnei, that gives us trouble. Velifnei Aaron, velifnei Elazar gomer. So das machriach Rashi zu lernen, als die Scheile ist gefragt geworden bei Sunde bei Aaron und Elazar v'cholei. That is why Rashi has to tell us that the question was directed towards Moshe and independently, even if it was simultaneously, was directed towards Aaron. It's not just the fact that Aaron happens to be sitting there or Elazar happens to be sitting there. So even though the question is directed at two different people, Rashi says it can't be that it was first to Moshe and then he doesn't know the answer, so we go to second best to Aaron or to Elazar. Can't be that. If you say there as noch fragen by Moshe and Otman gefragt by Aaron, and that you shouldn't think from the order of how the pasuk tells the story that when they saw Moshe didn't have the answer, they asked the next person. That's what Rashi says. They're both sitting in the Beis HaMedrash. Ba'u Shalom, they came to ask the question. Was in dem Ofen is the Scheile gewendet zu Aaron Punkt für zum Moshe Kidele Kamon, because Rashi is telling us that actually the question was being posed equally, simultaneously to both Moshe and to Aaron as a so-called group consultation, and that's because you have to visualize and appreciate how a Beis HaMedrash works, which is what Rashi wants us to know. So how does a Beis HaMedrash work? Beis HaMedrash is an order for Melen Torah zusammen. A Beis Medrash is a unique place. Everybody's learning Torah, and there's an equality between everybody who's learning Torah. It's nicht an Ort, wo ihnen versammeln sich zu hören Torah, Halacha, Drasha, v'chayotze b'zeh von hachacham. A Beis Medrash is not a description of a place where you come listen to the authority, the Rosh Yeshiva, the great person who's going to tell you things unequivocally. These are the halachas, etc. Das heißt, Hagam es in Beis Medrash, Faran, Arav, Rosh Hashiva, v'chayotze b'zeh. Sure, in the Beis Medrash there are some very qualified people, and there is a level of hierarchy. There's a person who heads up the Beis Medrash. And on the other hand, there are people who are only in the position of students, which is obviously less authoritative. And needless to say, there are different tiers of students. From Beis Medrash, the purpose and the ethos and atmosphere of a Beis Medrash is as alle Yoshev Beis Medrash sich mishtatef in dem Limud, herren die Scheile sheiklim v'toren u'ner v'chulei. It's a place where everybody hears the question, everybody weighs in, everybody picks it apart. It's an equal space. It's an horizontal environment. Therefore, you can understand that if a question is raised in the Beis HaMedrash, as opposed to going to a poisek to ask a question, the mechanism of how you ask a question in a Beis HaMedrash is really different to how you ask a question to an authority. If you have a question for the Rav, for a Dayan, for the Beis Din, then even if there happen to be many students standing around when you pose that particular question, is moving as the Shaila gefragt dafka bebezdin. It's pretty clear. You're in a Beis Din, you're asking the question of the authority of the Beis Din. Doesn't matter how many Talmidim are sitting and observing. So you don't want to hear from the Talmidim, you want to hear from the Beis Din, you want to hear from the Rav. But the moment you ask a question in the yeshiva setting, is gewendet nicht zum Rosh Beis Din yeshiva chesed, not to all yeshivas hamedrash. You naturally are directing your question at whoever is sitting there, not just the person who presides. Everybody has now an invitation to analyze this question and to weigh in on the question. Und da sagt Rashi, that's what Rashi is telling us in Parshas Ba'aloischa. Kishashneim yoshvim bebeis hamedrash, Moshe and Aaron are sitting in the Beis Hamedrash, bo'u she'olum, the people looking for an opportunity to bring the Korban Pesach, come and ask the Beis Hamedrash for insight. Das was Aaron had gehört die Shaila. The fact that Aaron hears the question being posed to Moshe is dass der Fall, wo sie seine Beide gewinnen und gelernt Torah zusammen bei Beis Hamedrash, is in the setting where Moshe and Aaron, are learning Torah together in a sense of equality. Was der Rebbe hat mit die Shaila gefragt in demselben Ofen, bei sie beide lifnei Moshe velifnei Aaron. So therefore the question is being posed to both of them equally. It's towards Moshe and it's towards Aaron because it's a Beis Hamedrash Shaila which goes towards whoever is sitting in the Beis Hamedrash. That's why when Rashi in our parasha quotes Abba Chanin, which he uses as his second explanation to suggest that Moshe and Elazar and the Nesim, etc., are in the Beis Hamedrash, his wording changes from the wording of the pasuk. The pasuk said Pesach Oyel Moed, and Rashi said Beis Hamedrash Yoshvim. He emphasizes they're sitting in a Beis Hamedrash. The Beis Hamedrash over there is not a description of the location, it's a description of the atmosphere. In dem was is given by Beis Hamedrash is because Rashi wants in that second explanation to explain that they're sitting in the Beis Hamedrash context, or nicht in dem Prat, as is given zusammen, rather than just saying they happen to be in the same location. They're in a Beis Hamedrash. So there's no question why it's posed lifnei Moshe, lifnei Elazar, lifnei Anasim, because that's how Beis Hamedrash works. The question is put to everybody who's sitting in that learning atmosphere. Okay, so if that's how Rashi explains Beis Hamedrash, that will help us understand why in our parasha he doesn't put it as the first explanation and instead favors Rabbi Yoshi's explanation. Even though we think that the concept of reordering a pasuk is the furthest thing from Pshat. Well, now we'll understand why Rashi doesn't put it as the first explanation. Why? Because we've got to determine what is pshat according to understanding of the context, and what is pshat according to the words of the pasuk. Rashi learned, as mit Pesach Oyel Moed. Rashi says when the Torah tells us Pesach Oyel Moed, that's where they were standing. Is the pasuk is nicht as zu unweisen dem Ort, wo sie seine gewen. Rashi is saying, if you're going to explain that it's Bebeis Hamedrash, then Pesach Oyel Moed is actually not a key part of the pasuk. Or the Meinafkimin, what's the difference where the Beis Hamedrash was? It's just telling us how they all came together. It happens to be the place of gathering. But here's the point. If I'm looking at the pshat of the words of the pasuk, Pesach Oyel Moed is not wording that indicates a Beis Hamedrash or a style of learning. It indicates a place of assembly. And normally when you assemble in that place, it's to listen to the authority who's going to tell you things. Moshe Rabbeinu is going to tell you, this is what Hashem told me. Kumtais. As in unser pasuk, is bepashtoi, nicht der Inyan from Bebeis Hamedrash oyu, no Pesach Oyel Moed kenal oyu. So if I'm looking at the words of the pasuk, then the pshat is not they were in a context of learning. The pshat is they were in a place where Moshe, the authority, gathers everybody together to tell them unequivocally these are the way that things should work. And if that's the case, then how do you ask the question to anybody else? You're coming to the Rav. So you could really try and stretch it and say, the reason it says Pesach Oyel Moed, because that is a place of gathering. That's really only to explain the last part of the pasuk that the whole nation was there. So you tell me it's a place of gathering, that's why everybody is there. So, in other words, Moshe, Elazar, and Nesim Bebeis Hamedrash Hayu. We could try and explain it this way. Moshe and all the leaders including Elazar, they're in the Beis HaMedrash. Und die Scheiles von Tzlafchad is gefragt geworden bei Zealamen zugleich, and therefore, because in the Beis HaMedrash, when the daughters of Tzlafchad pose their question, they're posing it to the team. The Derech HaShailes was very gefragt by Beis HaMedrash Kenal, as you do in a Beis HaMedrash, as we have explained. And at the same time, is the rest of the community is standing outside at the entrance, or whether it's outside or alongside, in a matzav shel hakala, congregated. And why they're there? Because they want to hear what the halacha is. They want to hear what the response is going to be to tzlafchad. Hey, it's a bit of a stretch to say that. Maybe more than a little bit of a stretch. It's a big stretch just to machalek zayin and pasuk, to start breaking up a pasuk. As Moshe lo zanesim zayin gesessen in Beis HaMedrash. Some of the people mentioned in the pasuk, the so-called leadership, they're sitting in the Beis HaMedrash. And in the same pasuk, with a vav, which refers to everybody else, no, they're actually standing somewhere else. That doesn't flow very well. So the pshat of the words of the pasuk don't work very well. Therefore, Rashi would very much like to say that the answer is like he said in Parashat Baloischa, that it's a place of Beis HaMedrash, and therefore the question is asked equally to everybody, except it doesn't work with the words of the psukim. Pesach Oyel Moed. Now we're splitting Kol Ha'eda from everybody else. It just doesn't make sense. Therefore, Rashi prefers to say Sarei Samikra. As das was the pasuk sagt lifnei Moshe velifnei Elazar HaKohen velifnei Anasiim, the fact that the pasuk says the question was posed to Moshe and it was posed in front of Elazar and it was posed in front of the Nesiim is weil man hat sich gefragt zeh. Now the Seid Ashai is verkehrt wie the Seid in pasuk. Actually, the pasuk does mean that the question was posed to different groups of people, but not in the order that it appears. First to the Nesiim, they didn't have the answer, so then to Elazar, he didn't have the answer, then to Moshe. The advantage of this is I don't have to change the words of the pasuk. And the Schwerkeit is blows in them, was the pasuk is them seder von den Yishalim. The only question that I have is why didn't the Torah list the correct words in the order in which it happened? So in other words, I don't have to now reinterpret Pesach Moed. I don't have to reinterpret that Moshe, Elazar, and the Nesiim are in one place and the Eidah is in another place. But I do have the niggling issue of why didn't the Torah just say in the correct order that the questions were actually asked. One of the questions we asked at the beginning is, not only does Rashi bring both opinions in our parasha, but he actually gives us the names, and Rashi doesn't usually give us the names unless that's going to add insight. Why here does he quote the names Rabbi Yosef Abba Chanan? So madgish zayin as the tzvei deis vitzu taichen dem pasuk is because Rashi wants us to know that the two different versions of how you interpret this pasuk are not simply about this pasuk. Whether the best solution is to change around the order that the words appear. As in ein und demselben pasuk on the Wörter nicht stehen ala seder, which suggests that it is possible in a single pasuk to have words that are not presented in the chronological order. Oder as is besser to deichak sein in Pirush HaKosav zu sagen Sarei Samikra, or would we rather change our understanding of the words of the pasuk rather than to rearrange the order of the pasuk? Those two views is not going to get to dem pasuk. Is not only something which is in context of this particular pasuk. This is actually a thematic perspective that both Rabbi Yoshe and Abba Chanan use in other places as well. In fact, if you do your research, you see that there are quite a number of places, as Rabbi Yoshe sagt, Zarei Samikra, that Rabbi Yoshe's approach to solving an issue in a pasuk is to say we've got to rearrange the order in which the pasuk appears. On Chittas Abba Chanan is as medaf reingehen in Adoichik in Pirush HaKsuvim or the Nitzag and Zarei Samikra, and Abba Chanan will always prefer to use a way to explain the psukim that is not exactly according to the simplest explanation, rather than reverse the order of the pasuk. So now that we understand what's happening, because in Parashat Baloischa we didn't have to play with the words of the pasuk, so it's easier to say it was a Beis HaMedrash and the pasuk was and the question was posed to both Moshe and Aaron simultaneously. Whereas in our pasuk it's difficult to say that, so that's why Rashi first puts Rabbi Yoshia. With that information, let's have a look at Parashat Shlach with the Mekosha Sheitzim, why Rashi doesn't say anything at all. So what is the real issue that's being discussed in these psukim? The fact that Yidden went with a question that they had, not just to Moshe, but to Aaron and Nochen Fring about Moshe Rabbeinu. The simplest way to understand it is it sounds like they went after having asked Moshe Rabbeinu and not having received an answer. Then they went to Aaron. That's our big question. Kinkashin is a question that doesn't even begin in the story of the Mekoshesh, because once we understand the nature of their question, we'll see this is not a big deal. Rashi tells us in the story of the guy who broke Shabbos, they didn't know which is the appropriate execution for him. But they did know that a person who wantonly desecrates Shabbos, it's a capital offense. Das heißt, as they're bringing him to Moshe Aaron, why did they bring this case in front of Moshe and Aaron and the community, or the Sanhedrin? It's not because they were asking, what is the halacha? Guilty or not? Execution or not? They actually came to hand him over to the authorities, so to speak. As that the authorities, or the community at large, would be able to carry out the judgment and the punishment that was required. So in other words, they weren't saying, let's ask the halachic question, does he deserve to die? They know he deserves to die. So now we're handing him over to those who have the power to execute him, to work out in which way they should do so. So if that's what they're looking for, then it's not a big deal that they see Moshe, Aaron, and everybody, so to speak, in the same light. Because the story is a story of handing somebody over to the communal authorities, of which Moshe is obviously a part, but so is Aaron, and so is the whole Sanhedrin. And that will also give us insight into another case that's actually quite similar to the case of the person who broke Shabbos. Which case is that? In the Parashas Mekalel, but Parashas Emer, we know that there's also some ambiguity when it comes to punishing the person who cursed Hashem's name, recorded in Parashas Emer at the end, where the pasuk says, "Vayaviu Yisrael Moshe, not to Moshe Alein." There it says that they only brought him to Moshe, no Aaron, no Kol Ha'eda, and Rashi doesn't discuss it. But it seems strange. The Mekoshesh and the Mekalel are given beperek echad. Rashi sagt dorten. Rashi immediately informs us over there that these two incidents, the incident of the person who broke Shabbos and the incident of the person who cursed Hashem, happened in a similar time period. So by Mekalel is davor given not to Moshe, and by the Mekoshesh to Moshe Aaron Kol Ha'eda. So how come, if they're happening simultaneously, is the question of the person who curses Hashem only presented to Moshe, and the question of the person who breaks Shabbos is presented to everybody? Well, actually, now we know it's really simple. Look at Rashi. It will make sense. Rashi tells us there, everybody knew that the person who breaks Shabbos has to be executed. But they just didn't know which form of execution. But with the story of the person who cursed Hashem, Moshe had to investigate the halacha. They didn't know if cursing Hashem's name is a capital offense or not. In other words, by the Mekalel is given onion for Nashal in halacha. The Mekalel, we have a question of halacha. Is he or isn't he chayav misa? Well, if you have a question in halacha, you go to the basin, you go to the ultimate Rav of the time, to the posek, to Moshe Rabbeinu, and nobody else. Whereas the person who broke Shabbos, we know the halacha, he is chayav misa. Now we only have a question of who's got the authority and how are they going to carry it out. Let's hand him over to the community. This all has a deeper message too. The Tam Pnimi Favos Rashi bring the Pirushim Dafka by the Parasha for Pesach Sheni or Parashas Bnei Tzlafchad. There's a deeper reason to why Rashi only comments on this question of whether or not whether they asked somebody after Moshe Rabbeinu or not. Rashi only records that in the story of Pesach Sheni and the story of Bnei Tzlafchad, or nit b'Parshas Mekoshesh Eitzim, and not in the story of the guy who broke Shabbos. It's because of the nature of how these two parashiyos played out. They both are stories of the power of Jewish input. How the Eibishter waits and wants us to contribute, and when we do, it has such a profound impact on Torah. The Chiddush in these two parashiyos is what both Parashas Pesach Sheni and Bnei Tzlafchad bring to the table is as both of them created a response from Hashem due to an initiative or an agitation from people. What precipitated Pesach Sheni? People complaining. How could we be pushed aside and not have the opportunity to bring a Korban Pesach? It bothered them. Likewise, with the daughters of Tzlafchad, it bothered them too. You can hear the same language. Why should our family be rejected? Give us a portion in the land also. As a result, they were given the entire halacha of inheritance. Und das ist echt die Scheiches zu die zwei Nyonim von Sareis HaMikra und Bebeis HaMidrash hayu yoshvin. This principle of Isarusa Dilasata, of us being able to invoke something from Hashem that wasn't originally part of the Torah, that links in to Rabbi Yoshe and Abba Chanan's opinions. In other words, whether you reorganize a pasuk, or whether this is an interaction that happened in a Beis HaMedrash, they both carry the same thing. Both views emphasize the value and greatness of human beings learning Torah. Sareis HaMikra, think about this. We have the power to reorganize a pasuk. The mikra ve'kum milmailo is nit moving. We've got a scenario over here where the Eibishter presented a pasuk, which you would think is the most pristine version of Torah, and yet we don't understand the pasuk. And yet we are empowered to rearrange the pasuk so that it becomes clear. It's an amazing gift that David has given us. Likewise, if you're going to say that this is a story of them being in the Beis HaMedrash, when people are learning in a Beis HaMedrash, that highlights human input, human endeavor in Torah, right? The greatness of the physical reality. Whereas if you were going to focus on the fact that everybody's gathered in front of Ohel Moed, that means they came Heren Dvar Hashem al Yidei Moshe, Hakel Esa'om B'Shnas Hakel, Heren Dvar Hashem al Yidei HaMelech V'Chayotze B'Zeh. That would all indicate the pristine word of Hashem coming channeled from on high through Moshe, or at the time of Hakel through the king. If you're talking about Pesach Ohel Moed, you're talking about Hashem's greatness. We just happen to be the audience. In fact, the ultimate definition of a Beis HaMedrash is that it cannot go by without innovation of Torah. Through the mental gymnastics, the interaction, the debate, that precipitates new insights in Torah that were not originally included. This is very similar to the advantage of the oral over the written Torah. The written Torah, that's the pristine presentation of how it comes from on high, and it's immutable. But you don't see the detail. What? What do you tie on your arm? When do you tie them? What are they? What do you write on your door? And in Torah Shabbal Peh, when you have the oral Torah, that's human endeavor, us working to understand and extrapolate and pass down the traditions. And through that, to the extent, like the Rebbe Rashab says in Hemshech Samech Vav, that the truth of Torah is that there are elements that were innovated through Torah Shabbal Peh, that we bring an asmachta, we have to bring support from a pasuk to show that it's actually genuine, because it's not something which is, so to speak, from the original. And that's the beauty of these two stories. They both speak about the empowerment that Hashem has given us, that we can add to the Torah. And that would also, okay, so now that we understand that there are these two possibilities, that the Beis HaMedrash represents human endeavor and reordering a pasuk represents human endeavor, now we'll understand why in Parshas Ba'aloischa Rashi only brings the Beis HaMedrash, whereas in our Parsha he brings both. In the story of Pesach Sheni in Parshas Ba'aloischa, Rashi only offers the possibility that they were sitting in a Beis HaMedrash to indicate the human input. And by Bnei Slavchad bring to Beida Pirushim on the Pirusha Ikri Saris Mikra, whereas in our parasha, with the daughters of Slavchad, Rashi not only quotes both opinions, but he puts the Saris Mikra, the reordering of the pasuk, as the primary explanation. Why? The chilek from Saris Mikra and Yoshim Beis HaMedrash is, in spite of the fact that both of these explanations indicate the greatness of human endeavor, the difference between reordering a pasuk and sitting in a Beis HaMedrash is as follows. Saris HaMikra is madgishem seder v'di inyan is vashriben in Torah. When we talk about reorganizing a pasuk, our focus is still on the words as they are in the Torah. Mashenke Beis HaMedrash is madgishem dem limud. Whereas when I talk about the Beis HaMedrash, I'm highlighting the fact that there's a learning process going on, and through that learning process we will arrive at the innovative perspective that we need. In Parashat Pesach Sheni, with that in mind, when we talk about the story of the Pesach Sheni, everybody understands that because they complained, a new law was introduced to Judaism called Pesach Sheni. A brand new parasha was stated in the Torah. So therefore, Rashi says, well, you know what's going to tell us that story? The fact that Moshe and Aaron are sitting in a Beis HaMedrash, because a Beis HaMedrash is a place where you introduce new halachas, where you get these fresh perspectives, and that's exactly what happened in that story. That's not what happened with the story of Bnei Slavchad. In the case of Bnei Slavchad, Rashi Dafka tells us that Moshe temporarily could not recall the halacha. The halacha is shein gezakiv worden zu Moshe. That halacha had already been presented. It was already in writing. There's already a mikra. Und der Auftrag von dem Bnei Slavchad is given, wie Rashi is mitayg, zachu menichteva al yadon. So what that means is that thanks to Bnei Slavchad, information that had already been presented to Moshe Rabbeinu, so to speak, in a way of Torah B'chsav, now actually gets recorded in the Torah as a parasha. So it's not a new mitzvah that's being introduced. It's a mitzvah that was hidden from view that's now going to be written thanks to them. As durch sie ist der Halacha noch einmal nisgalig geworden zu Moshe und damals verschieben geworden in Torah. Thanks to the daughters of Slavchad, Moshe is reminded of the halacha, and therefore the halacha is recorded. On the Rebbe, the Pirusha Ishim Va'ikri Saris HaMikra. So what represents that? Taking a mikra, information that already exists, and reworking it. As das ist verschrieben geworden an Neifen, was ist madgeshiminin von Avodas Hamata. You're writing the pasuk. You're writing it differently. Before the pasuk was, so to speak, in Moshe's knowledge alone. And now you're rewriting. So what's happening over here is we're emphasizing that our efforts reveal something that had to be, or that had been hidden within Torah. But there is a view that says differently. Rashi is the one who says Moshe knew the halacha and temporarily couldn't recall it. But there's a different opinion that says, even in the Sifri, that says that the parasha of Nachlos, of inheritance, was introduced thanks to the daughters of Slavchad in the same way as Pesach Sheni was introduced thanks to the people who complained. So if that's the case, bring Donach Rashi Eichdideh von Abachonon as by Beis HaMedrash Yoshvin to reflect that opinion. Rashi also quotes the view of Abachonon that there's a Beis HaMedrash happening over here. Beis HaMedrash means where we introduce something that was not there originally. So the Eibusha should bench us, just like the daughters of Tzlafchad who complained that they needed inheritance, and therefore that introduced from on high the parasha of inheritance. Not just the parasha of inheritance in theory, but most importantly the fact that it was translated into action, which means the fact that they were actually given a piece of Eretz Yisrael. So the same thing should happen for us. Now that we're at the end of Golus, as the Bekasha was eaten halten in einbetten beim Eibishten. The request that we consistently ask of Hashem to send Mashiach quickly, that we should see the return to Yerushalayim with our own eyes. So that should bring down the ultimate gula, in which case each one of us will have very clearly and revealed our portion in Eretz Yisrael. And this will be a unique division of the land of Israel, which the Eibishter will do himself. It should happen mamash immediately.